Jake Montgomery was a man of few words and even fewer friends. He had learned long ago that life in the Wild West wasn't a place for softness. The desert wind blew across the wide, open plains, carrying the dust of a land that was as unforgiving as the heart of any man who called it home. Jake had learned that the hard way. His once promising life as a rancher had been destroyed piece by the very violence that made the West famous. A year ago, he had lived a different life. He had a family, a home, and a piece of land he could call his own. But that had all changed in a single night. A gang of raiders had swept through his farm, killing his parents and setting fire to everything he had worked for. The fire that took his home took more than just his property. It took his soul. Since that night, Jake couldn't bring himself to stay in one place for too long. The memories of what happened haunted him everywhere he went. His heart, once full of love and hope, had turned as cold as the steel of the revolver he carried by his side. No matter how far he traveled, the pain followed him. The sound of a horse's hooves galloping across the desert, the crackling of a campfire, or the distant howl of a coyote. All these things reminded him of the past, of the family he had lost, and the life he could never get back. Jake's journey had taken him through towns, farms, and even the edges of Indian territories. He didn't care where he went anymore. He had become a wanderer, a drifter. He had no destination, no home, and no purpose except for putting as many miles between him and the ghosts of his past. And that was how he ended up in a small, dusty trading post one hot afternoon in the middle of Apache country. It wasn't much of a town, just a few wooden shacks, a saloon, and a general store. It was a place where people came to trade goods and share stories, but it wasn't a place for someone like Jake. People didn't know him here, and he preferred it that way. He entered the saloon, his boots kicking up the dust from the dirt floor. The barkeep didn't look up when he entered. People like Jake were regulars, always passing through, always looking for a drink and a night's rest before moving on again. Jake ordered a whiskey, his hand steady as he placed it on the counter. The bartender, a burly man with a thick mustache, slid the glass toward him without saying a word. Jake took a long sip, feeling the warmth of the alcohol slide down his throat. The sharp bite of the liquor didn't do much to numb the pain, but it was enough to keep him from thinking too much about the past. As he sat at the bar, a voice interrupted his solitude. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Jake looked up, startled by the sudden presence of an elderly man sitting across from him. The man had long gray hair tied back in a ponytail, and his weathered face carried the weight of many years in the harsh desert sun. His eyes, however, were sharp and full of wisdom. "You're not from around here," the man said, his voice low but clear. Jake narrowed his eyes. "No, just passing through," he replied, not in the mood for conversation but not wanting to be rude. The old man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I can tell. You've got the look of someone who's lost a lot." Jake's jaw tightened. He hadn't come here to talk about his past, but the old man had already picked up on something Jake had been trying to hide for so long. It was in his eyes, the way he carried himself, a man broken by the world but too proud to admit it. "What do you want?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though the old man's words had made him uncomfortable. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long, slow sip from his own glass, the silence hanging between them like a thick fog. Finally, he spoke again. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen men like you before. Wanderers. Men who have lost everything, and because of that, they're willing to risk it all to find peace. But peace doesn't come easy out here." He gestured toward the desert outside where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "Out here, peace is something you have to fight for. And sometimes you have to choose between fighting for the past or fighting for the future." Jake felt a strange twist in his chest. The old man's words had hit too close to home. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear anymore. But something about the way the man spoke with such certainty made Jake want to listen. "I'm not here to offer you advice," the old man continued, his voice softening. "I'm just telling you that sometimes the past can be a heavy weight to carry. But it doesn't have to crush you. If you let it, it will. But if you find the right people, if you trust them, maybe it can be lightened. Maybe you can find a way to move forward." Jake didn't know how to respond. He had spent so long running from the past he didn't know how to face it. The thought of confronting it, of letting someone else in, seemed impossible. He was used to being alone, but the old man's words stayed with him. As the conversation wound down, the old man left the saloon, disappearing into the dust, and Jake was left alone once again with his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir deep inside, a flicker of hope, buried under the layers of pain. The flicker was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Jake finished his drink and stood up. His feet carried him outside where the desert night was settling in. The stars above shone brightly, the only lights in an otherwise dark world. He hadn't planned to stay in this town long, but something felt different now. It was as if the wind had shifted and a new direction was calling him. Maybe it was the old man's words, or maybe it was the weight of his own heart that was finally pushing him to stop running. Either way, Jake Montgomery knew one thing for certain: the road ahead would be different. He couldn't explain why, but deep down he knew that this town, this night, would change everything. And just as he was about to mount his horse and leave, he heard it, the soft, distant sound of someone calling his name. Jake was already halfway to his horse when he heard the soft, almost desperate knock on the door. He paused, his hand still gripping the reins of his mount. The sound was faint but unmistakable. He turned slowly, puzzled. The night was still and quiet, the only noise the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. He had expected to be alone tonight, just him and the stars. He stepped back into the small cabin, leaving the door open, and looked around. The low flickering of the lantern cast long shadows on the wooden walls. For a moment he thought about ignoring the knock. It could be anyone, a wanderer, a trader, or perhaps even someone looking for trouble. Jake had seen all sorts pass through this part of the desert. Most of them didn't stick around for long, but then he heard it again, this time more insistent, a soft tap, tap, tap. Curiosity got the better of him. With a sigh, Jake walked over to the door and swung it open, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver just in case. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She wasn't much older than him, maybe in her early 30s, with dark hair that cascaded down her shoulders in waves. Her face was pale, almost as if she hadn't seen sunlight in weeks, and her eyes, those eyes were filled with a deep sadness, a sorrow so heavy that it seemed to weigh her down. She wore a simple dress, and there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, though the tremor in her hands told a different story. Jake's first instinct was to shut the door. He didn't know her, and he wasn't in the mood to get involved in anyone's troubles. But there was something about her, something that kept him rooted in place. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need your help." Jake studied her face, his hand still resting on the doorframe. His eyes scanned her, searching for any sign of deceit, but all he saw was the truth, raw, unfiltered pain. There was no mistaking the desperation in her tone. He didn't speak immediately, unsure of how to respond. He had learned a long time ago not to get involved with others, especially not strangers. But her plea, her voice filled with quiet desperation, struck a chord inside him. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. He hadn't planned on helping anyone tonight. Hell, he hadn't planned on helping anyone ever again. But something about this woman standing alone in the dark, with nothing but a simple dress and a look that screamed for help, made him hesitate. "My name is Ayanna," she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "I'm from a nearby Apache village. My people, we're in danger, and I don't know where else to turn." Jake's brow furrowed. Apache? He hadn't had much contact with the tribes in these parts, though he knew enough to understand that they weren't always on friendly terms with outsiders. But there was something about Ayanna's urgency that told him this wasn't about politics or land disputes. "Danger," Jake repeated, his voice hardening. "What kind of danger?" Ayanna's eyes flickered to the ground for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "There are settlers, men from a nearby town. They've been threatening my village for weeks now, but today they came close. Very close. They've already attacked other villages, and I'm afraid my people won't survive another raid." Jake could see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes, but she fought them back, pressing her lips together in an attempt to stay strong. But it was clear. Ayanna was at the end of her rope. Jake could feel a knot form in his chest as he listened to her. The land was harsh, and the people who lived in it were often forced to fight for survival. The violence between settlers and native tribes was nothing new. He had seen enough of it to know that when it came down to it, only the strongest would survive. The weak were forgotten, trampled under the boots of those who wanted more land, more power. But Ayana's plea wasn't just about survival. It was about her people, her family, her home, and for some reason Jake couldn't turn his back on that. "Why me?" he asked. "I'm just a cowboy passing through. What makes you think I can help you?" Ayana took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke again. "I've heard stories about you, about how you're skilled with a rifle, how you fought in the last war. You've got experience, and I've been told you don't have a home, that you've been running. I don't know why you're out here, but I need you." "We need you." Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. He hadn't asked for anyone to notice him. He hadn't wanted anyone to remember the man he used to be, the man who had fought and bled for causes that now felt distant and meaningless. But there was something in Ayana's eyes, something raw and real, that made him feel like he couldn't just turn his back. "You're asking me to risk my life for people I don't even know?" he asked, his voice low but laced with disbelief. "I'm not asking you to do it for nothing," Ayana replied quickly. "I'm asking you because my people will die without your help, and I'm asking you because I can see that you've lost something too. I know the pain in your eyes. I've seen it before. And I believe that if you help us, you'll find something that's been missing for a long time." Jake stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. He had lost something more than he cared to admit. Maybe it was the love of his family. Maybe it was his purpose, or maybe it was just the will to keep going. But whatever it was, he hadn't found it again. Not in the endless days spent alone on the road. For a long moment, Jake said nothing. He just stood there, his eyes locked with Ayana's, feeling the pull of her words. Finally, he sighed, and with a slow shake of his head, he spoke. "All right, I'll help you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you're going to have to tell me everything. Where are they now? How many men are we dealing with?" Ayana's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you so much. I'll tell you everything." As she began to explain the situation, Jake listened intently, his mind already working out a plan. He wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to turn his back on Ayana. Not after everything she had said. Not after seeing the desperation in her eyes. And as the night stretched on, Jake knew that his life was about to change again. This time, however, it wasn't just about running anymore. It was about standing up. About doing something that mattered. The moon hung high above them, casting a pale silver light across the endless stretch of desert. The night was still, the only sound the soft clop of hooves against the dry ground and the occasional rustling of wind through the brush. Jake rode ahead, his eyes scanning the landscape, always alert. He had no idea what kind of trouble they were walking into, but something about the quiet desert night told him it was only a matter of time before they reached the heart of danger. Beside him, Ayana rode silently, her figure outlined against the darkened sky. She had changed into a long cloak, its dark fabric billowing behind her as her horse trotted at a steady pace. The two had hardly spoken since they left the cabin, the silence between them comfortable but tense. Jake could sense her nerves, but he wasn't sure if it was the mission or something else that weighed on her heart. As they rode, the faint light of the stars seemed to stretch across the sky, guiding their way forward. Jake knew the desert well. He had spent years of his life crossing its vast, empty expanses, but this land, Apache land, was different. There was a history here, a weight that Jake couldn't quite put his finger on. He had heard the stories, of course. Stories about the Apache people, their land, and the fierce warriors who protected it. But it wasn't until now, riding beside Ayana, that he felt like he was stepping into something much larger than himself. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt something stir inside him. He had never been one to talk about feelings or emotions, but something in Ayana's quiet strength made him wonder if there was still hope for him to find his place in the world again. He didn't know her well, but her courage was obvious. She wasn't just a woman running away from danger. She was someone who had lost everything and still managed to carry on. And that in itself was a kind of strength that Jake couldn't help but respect. "So what's your village like?" Jake asked, his voice breaking the silence. Ayana glanced at him, surprised by the question. It was the first time he had shown any interest in her life. For a moment she hesitated, as though considering whether or not to share. But then, as if making up her mind, she spoke. "It's small, but it's home," she said softly, her gaze distant, as though she could already see it in her mind's eye. "There are maybe 50 of us, mostly families. We live off the land, hunting and gathering. We don't have much, but we have enough to survive. We've been here for generations, living the way our ancestors did. It's peaceful, mostly." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had never known what it was like to live close to the land, to be connected to a place in such a deep spiritual way. He had always been a wanderer, moving from one town to the next, looking for something that he couldn't name. But as Ayanna spoke, Jake realized that what he had been searching for all this time, home, belonging, was exactly what she had in her village. And now he was riding into that world, a world so different from his own. "What about your husband?" Jake asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. He had been wondering about her for a while, about the man she had spoken of so briefly before. The one who had died. Ayanna's face seemed to soften at the mention of him. Her eyes, dark and deep, took on a faraway look, as though she was recalling a memory she held dear. "His name was Kanti," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He was a warrior, brave and strong. He was always the first to volunteer for a difficult task, the first to protect our people. He and we met when I was just a girl. We didn't have much, but we loved each other. When we married, I thought we'd grow old together. We had dreams, Jake, dreams of children, of building a life, but the war came and he went to fight and I never saw him again." She paused, the memory of her husband lingering in the air between them. "He died defending our village. They came for us, the other tribe, and he was the last one to fight. He saved me. He saved us all." Jake felt a lump form in his throat as he listened. He hadn't known love like that, not since the death of his own family. And though Ayanna's story was full of loss, there was something deeply beautiful about the love she had shared with Kanti. It was the kind of love that gave you the strength to fight, the kind of love that left an imprint on your heart that never faded. "No matter what came afterward, I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice low. He wasn't good at offering comfort, but he meant it. He could hear the pain in Ayanna's voice, the echo of grief that hadn't been allowed to rest. Ayanna nodded, but her lips curled into a faint smile, one full of strength and sorrow all at once. "Thank you. But it's not just the loss that hurts. It's what he left behind. Our people need protection, Jake. We can't do this alone. That's why I came to you. I didn't know who else to trust." Jake looked at her, a sense of resolve filling him. She was right. Whatever the cost, he had to help her. It was no longer about running from his past. It was about doing something that mattered, something real. As they continued to ride, the night seemed to stretch on forever. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable now, it was peaceful, even comforting. Jake wasn't used to being around others, but Ayanna's calm presence made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always believed. Hours passed, and the desert landscape changed as they rode deeper into Apache territory. The dry, barren hills gave way to rougher terrain, the land growing steeper and rockier with each passing mile. Despite the darkness, Jake's sharp eyes caught every detail of the terrain. He had always been a tracker, a man who could read the land like an open book. It was a skill that had served him well over the years, and it was the only skill he had that felt like it mattered anymore. Ayanna, though quiet, seemed to notice the change as well. She sat straighter in her saddle, her eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for something to appear. Her instincts were sharp, just as Jake's were. She was a part of this land, and in her own way, she knew it just as well as he did. "We're getting close," Ayanna murmured, her voice breaking the silence once again. Jake nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his back. "Stay close," he advised. "We don't know what we're walking into." The air seemed to grow thicker with each mile, the weight of their journey pressing down on both of them. But as the first rays of dawn began to light the sky, Jake knew they were about to reach the village. Whatever awaited them, he would face it head-on. The ride had been long, the night filled with memories, but now, as the desert began to come alive with the light of a new day, Jake could feel something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the first light of dawn began to break across the horizon, Jake and Ayanna arrived at the outskirts of her village. The once serene and peaceful land now felt different, darker, more foreboding. The wind that had been calm before now seemed to carry a warning, whispering through the dry grasses and rocky terrain. The desert had its own language, one that Jake had learned to respect over the years, and right now, it felt as though the land itself was holding its breath. Ayanna, who had been unusually quiet as they neared the village, finally spoke. "We're close," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide with concern, but there was also a flicker of determination in them. She had led them this far, and now it was time to face what she had feared most. Her hands, which had gripped the reins tightly all night, loosened just slightly as she spoke, but her body remained tense, ready for whatever might come next. Jake nodded, his jaw set. His hand rested on the grip of his rifle as he scanned the land ahead. The village lay just beyond a small hill, and he could see smoke rising in the distance. It was faint, but it was enough to make his stomach twist. He knew that smoke wasn't from a peaceful fire. It was from something much worse, something that told him the settlers had already arrived. "We need to hurry," Ayanna said, urging her horse forward. Jake followed, keeping his pace steady, but the urgency in her voice made his heart race. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew that they were walking straight into danger. As they crested the hill, the full sight of the village came into view. The village, which had once been a safe haven for Ayanna and her people, now looked like a war zone. There were signs of a struggle, broken branches, trampled earth, and a trail of blood leading toward the center of the village. Jake could see figures moving in and out of the small adobe homes, but these figures weren't Apache. They were settlers, armed, dangerous, and determined. Jake's grip on his rifle tightened. These weren't just any settlers. He recognized the leader immediately. Harlan Griggs, a man he had seen before in various parts of the West, known for his ruthlessness and greed. Griggs had been responsible for more than one attack on native tribes in the region, always looking for ways to expand his land and push the Apache further from their ancestral territories. It was no surprise that he had found his way to Ayanna's village. "What are they doing?" Jake muttered under his breath, watching as Griggs barked orders to his men, pushing them from house to house, searching for something, anything to take. "They're stealing from us," Ayanna whispered, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. "They've taken everything of value. Our food, our tools, even the livestock. They'll burn what's left." Jake's heart sank as he watched the chaos unfold before him. He couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. He had to act, but the odds were against them. Griggs had at least 10 men, all armed and ready for a fight. He knew that going in head first would be suicide, but he wasn't about to let Ayanna's people suffer anymore. "We need a plan," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "We can't take them all on at once." Ayanna nodded, her eyes scanning the village. "We can't fight them directly. Not all of us. But there are hidden paths, ways to move without being seen. I can show you." Jake looked at her, surprised. He had assumed that they would have to face the settlers head-on, but Ayanna's words gave him hope. If they could use the land to their advantage, they might have a chance. "Show me," he said, already starting to move. Ayanna led him quietly down the side of the hill, moving toward the back of the village. The path she chose was narrow, winding through thick brush and boulders. They moved slowly and cautiously, every step deliberate. Jake's eyes stayed sharp, his mind focused on the task at hand. He was used to working alone, but now he was part of something bigger, a fight for survival, for justice, and that gave him a new sense of purpose. As they reached the edge of the village, Ayanna signaled for him to stop. She crouched low and Jake followed suit. Ahead of them, he could see the figures of the settlers moving between the houses, still ransacking everything they could find. But there was something else, something that caught Jake's eye. A small group of Apache men, led by Chief Black Cloud, had positioned themselves in the shadows. They were waiting, their bows and arrows ready, their eyes fixed on the settlers. It was clear they were planning an ambush, but they needed help to make it successful. Ayanna turned to Jake, her face determined. "I'll go to the chief. I'll make sure he knows we're here to help." Jake nodded. "Be careful. Don't let them see you." Ayanna gave him a small, reassuring smile, then slipped into the shadows, moving with the grace of someone who had grown up on this land, someone who knew its secrets like the back of her hand. Jake stayed where he was, his rifle ready. He could feel the tension in the air. Everything was about to change. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and he held his breath, watching as one of the settlers walked right into his line of sight. The man was holding a sack of stolen goods, his back turned to Jake. It was a perfect shot, but Jake didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. Ayana returned, silently appearing at Jake's side. "The chief's ready," she whispered. "We'll attack when the time is right." Jake's pulse quickened. He knew this was it, the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. He could hear the sound of Griggs shouting orders in the distance, and his anger boiled over. These people had come to take everything Ayana's village had, to destroy what they had worked so hard to build. Jake couldn't allow that to happen. Ayana gave him one last look before signaling to the Apache men. The ambush was set. Jake's eyes locked onto the nearest settler, the one who had been moving with the sack. He raised his rifle, steadying his aim. His heart was pounding, but he focused on the task at hand. He knew what needed to be done. And then, in a flash, everything exploded into chaos. The first arrow flew through the air, hitting its target with a sharp thud. The settlers yelled in surprise, scrambling to defend themselves. The Apache men moved quickly, striking from all sides, their arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. Jake fired his rifle, the sound of the shot ringing through the village. A settler went down, but Jake didn't have time to think about it. There was no time for hesitation. Ayana was at his side again, guiding him through the chaos. The fight was intense, but the Apache had the advantage. The settlers, caught off guard by the ambush, were struggling to fight back. Griggs, who had been shouting orders just moments ago, was now desperately trying to organize his men. But it was too late. The Apache were in control. Jake felt the adrenaline surge through his veins, pushing him forward. He was no longer the man who had wandered the desert alone. He was part of something larger now, something worth fighting for. As the battle raged on, he knew that the tide had turned. They were going to win this fight. And for the first time in years, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. The battle raged around them, the sounds of shouting and gunfire mixing with the sharp twang of arrows slicing through the air. Jake's pulse was racing, his rifle steady in his hands as he fought alongside the Apache warriors. Each shot fired with purpose. He had never imagined himself in a situation like this, fighting for something greater than himself. But now, with the village of Ayana's people in the balance, it felt as though his entire life had led to this moment. The tide of the battle was shifting. The settlers, who had been so confident just moments ago, were now scrambling for cover, their efforts to retaliate falling apart in the face of the coordinated assault by the Apache. Ayana's village, once on the brink of destruction, was now under the protection of those who called the land their own. Jake could hear Ayana's voice calling out, urging the warriors to stay focused, to keep pushing forward. Her determination was like a fire, and it fueled the others around her. Jake glanced over to see her in the middle of the action, her face set in a look of fierce resolve. She wasn't just defending her home. She was protecting everything that mattered to her, everything she had lost and everything she hoped for in the future. It was clear that she would not let these settlers take away her people's way of life. But amidst the chaos, Jake's mind was focused on something else. Griggs. He had been searching for the leader of the settlers ever since the battle had begun, knowing that if Griggs was taken down, the remaining men would be lost without their leader. Finally, he spotted him. Griggs was behind a rock, shouting orders to his remaining men, trying desperately to rally them. He was a big man with a hard face and the kind of arrogance that made Jake's blood boil. This was the man who had brought violence and suffering to so many. The man who cared only for his own gain, never considering the destruction he left behind. Jake moved quickly, his boots kicking up dust as he made his way toward the rock where Griggs was hiding. His heart thudded in his chest, but there was no hesitation in his step. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting the innocent, stopping the man who had caused so much harm. Griggs spotted him just as Jake was closing in, his eyes flashing with recognition and anger. He reached for his rifle, but Jake was faster. With a quick, practiced motion, Jake raised his own rifle and aimed directly at Griggs. For a moment, the two men locked eyes. Jake could see the fear in Griggs' eyes, but there was also a cold defiance there. Griggs wasn't going down without a fight, but Jake wasn't about to give him that chance. Enough of this, Jake muttered under his breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. But just as he was about to fire, something stopped him. A voice, soft but clear, reached his ears. "Jake, don't." It was Ayana. She had moved closer, unnoticed by Jake in the heat of the moment. She was standing a few feet away, her hand held out as if to stop him. Her eyes were wide, pleading with him to reconsider. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He froze, his rifle still aimed at Griggs. His thoughts swirled, the tension in the air thick. The fight had been brutal, and Griggs had caused so much pain. But there was something in Ayanna's face, something that made Jake lower his rifle. "Let him go," she said softly, her voice filled with a calm that seemed out of place amidst the chaos. "We've already won. Killing him won't bring back what we've lost." Jake stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. He knew she was right. Taking Griggs's life wouldn't undo the destruction he had caused. It wouldn't heal the wounds of the past. It wouldn't bring back the lives that had been lost or fix the damage done to her people. Griggs, sensing the hesitation, sneered. "You think you've won, Apache?" He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over?" Jake's grip on his rifle tightened again, but it wasn't anger that fueled his hand this time. It was something else. Something deep within him. Something that had been buried for so long. He had spent years running from the pain of his past, clinging to anger and vengeance as though they were the only things that could keep him alive. But now in this moment he realized that there was another way, a better way. Ayanna had shown him that. "Get out of here," Jake said, his voice steady. "Leave now. Go back to your people and never come back." Griggs looked at him, clearly surprised, but he didn't move. He was used to power, used to forcing others to obey him. But Jake wasn't afraid of him anymore. He had something Griggs didn't. A reason to live that didn't come from fear or violence. Ayanna stepped forward, standing beside Jake, her eyes never leaving Griggs. "If you leave now, we won't chase you," she said firmly. "But if you come back, we'll fight again. And this time, there won't be any mercy." Griggs's gaze flickered between the two of them, and for a moment Jake thought he might charge them anyway. But then the realization seemed to hit him. His men were defeated, his plans in ruins. He was alone. With one last defiant glare, Griggs turned and disappeared into the desert, his footsteps growing fainter as he left the village behind. Jake stood there for a long moment, watching him go. The anger that had built up in him over the years didn't disappear completely, but it didn't consume him either. It was as if the weight of it had been lifted just a little, replaced by something lighter, something he hadn't felt in years. "You did the right thing," Ayanna said, her voice soft but full of conviction. Jake turned to her, meeting her gaze. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. She had known from the start that this wasn't about vengeance. It was about something deeper, something that came from healing, from choosing a path that would lead to a better future for everyone. Ayanna reached out and touched his arm gently. "Thank you, Jake, for everything." Jake nodded, but he didn't speak. Words didn't seem necessary anymore. The battle had ended and peace had been restored for now. But more than that, something had shifted inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not because of the fight they had won, but because he had made a choice. A choice to stop running and to finally face what was ahead. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light over the village, Jake knew that his journey wasn't over. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel lost.